We begin with the words of Robert Frost. I have been one acquainted with the night. I have walked out in rain, in back, in rain. I have outwalked the farthest city light. I have looked down the saddest city lane. I have passed by the watchman on his beat and dropped my eyes, unwilling to explain. I stood still and stopped the sound of feet, when far away an interrupted cry came over houses from another street, but not to call me back or say goodbye. And further still, at an unearthly height, one luminary clock against the sky proclaimed the time was neither right nor wrong. I have been one acquainted with the night. When I was in middle school, maybe I was 13 or 14. I don't quite remember. I was too young to drive, but old enough to hang out with friends late on a Friday night, maybe all the way to 10 p.m., well past dark. In rural New London, Minnesota, where I'm from, growing up in the 90s, was an interesting time. We did not yet have cell phones, but we played our fair share of video games. Some people had computers at their homes with dial-up internet. Most did not. So what do we do for fun? Many things, I'm sure, but one consistent activity in those years, we played night games. At some point in that week, we'd pick a neighborhood, we'd pick a time, again, because we couldn't text one another to figure out the details. And we'd all meet up there on a Friday night as the sun was going down. And we'd play. Boys and girls alike, gangly, zit-faced, braces on our teeth. We play hide and go seek with flashlights, kick the can. The ghost comes out at midnight in the cemetery. I couldn't imagine doing that 10 years later when I would live in urban Chicago as a graduate student. But to have been able to play and find joy in what felt like beautiful darkness, it felt so free. In that same era, my friends and I also watched movies that would make us fear the dark. Chucky, Freddy Krueger, Scream. I remember in high school, my entire volleyball team slept over one night at someone's cabin out on a lake, and we watched a VHS of some scary film. We were all in sleeping bags in the living room across the floor, and we suddenly, as the movie got scarier and scarier, we became like caterpillars or log rollers, each trying to jump over each other towards the middle of the room so we wouldn't have to be the girl sleeping on the outer side of, whatever darkness loomed. When do we begin to fear the darkness? Is it something we're born with, or is it taught? Whether it's the monsters under our bed or the demons of our shadow side, why is it we are so quick to deny, dismiss, or dispel what we perceive as dark? Does ignoring the night, or metaphorically filling our life with blinding light and activity, really serve us? Today, as we move into winter solstice, we'll explore this paradoxical truth of what is often presented as a binary. Just as grief is a part of love, just as boredom births creativity, the lightest day needs the darkest night. And as it turns out, so might our spirits. Most of us, though, we very rarely experience actual literal darkness. According to an article in the BBC from 2016, light pollution affects 80% of the global population. Light pollution being defined as excessive, misdirected, or obtrusive, artificial, usually outdoor light. In many areas of our globe, we are learning that the night is so bright that people can actually use their colored daytime vision to look up at the sky. While it's good for safety to have a well-lit street, for example, too much light messes with nocturnal animals. It can have an adverse effect on our health. It wastes energy. A third of the world population cannot now see the Milky Way. True darkness, well, you'd have to go on a mind tour for that. I wonder how many of you have been on the Quincy Mine tour or another one, where you're led deep, deep, deep into the side of a mountain. And you learn all about, the tools that the miners used, how hard it was to bring up the load, so much about their life. But then the tour guide, just at the right moment, clicks off those electric lights, probably strung up by Michigan Tech, right? And if that kid with his mom's cell phone actually keeps it off, the tunnel becomes inky black, like a blanket. You can't see your hand in front of your face or the 20 other people on the tour in their yellow hats with you. And there are uncomfortable giggles and even a few screams, even amongst the adults, until the moment when the guide lights a match and puts it in a candle in his hard hat to give us all a sense of what they used to labor in, that flicker of light, how dark it really was. Reminds me of the words of Wendell Berry. He says, to go in the dark with a light is to know the light. To know the dark, go dark. Go without sight. And find that the dark too blooms and sings and is traveled by dark feet and dark wings. Darkness. Is it good? Is it bad or neutral? My 9-year-old would answer definitely in the negative. And just the other day, we were driving to school. It was still dark. And I was saying, we always do our gratitudes. We share gratitudes in the car ride. And I shared that I was grateful for the darkness of December because it let me see neighbors' twinkle lights for a few minutes more. But Maida, my 9-year-old, replied emphatically, I don't like the dark. And she was going to just leave it like that. And myself, ever mining for sermon material, I asked her, well, why not? And she said, well, the dark is scary. You never know what's out there, what could be coming. It's creepy. And I guess that's what we're taught, isn't it? Monsters live in the dark. The Dark Ages was a time of the past, of ignorance, of suffering. The woman of the night does not necessarily have a positive title connotation. Dr. Janine M. Canty is a professor in the Transformative Studies doctoral program at California Institute of Integral Studies in San Francisco. In an article titled Beautiful Darkness, she points out that Western society as a whole has an unhealthy relationship with darkness. Darkness is feared and often demonized. And from her perspective as an environmental studies professor, she sees this linked with the fear of wilderness, the primal, the dark other, the female body, and the numinous. And that fear, according to Canty, gives birth to a separation from nature, disembodiment, patriarchy, and a host of other oppressive behaviors and systems. Canty points out that this fear makes its home within a binary worldview where dark is seen as the opposite of light, a fight between good and evil, a sterilized reality with well-ordered boxes of right, wrong, me and not me, rational, irrational, white, and black. Theologian Barbara Holmes shows us how this connects to systemic racism and points back to European Christianity as the source of some of this worldview. She says, even though we are told that the evil one masquerades as an angel of light and that God dwells in the welcoming darkness, we persist in this connection of light and white with goodness and holiness. The outcome is that those who live in dark skins become shadows in the world. Carolyn Merchant is an ecofeminist and philosopher. She echoes that sentiment. Europeans, she writes, associated Blackness with witchcraft, Satan, beasts, and putrid decaying matter. As these scholars point out, and many others have as well, there is a deeply buried association within Western culture around darkness and Blackness that have not only bred fear, but hatred. But what if, like so many things, this binary worldview simply doesn't hold up? What if it is, as Peter Mayer sings, maybe that peace hides in a storm, maybe winter's heart is warm, maybe light itself is born, in the longest night. It bears reflecting on, because winter comes every year, and perhaps that season which lacks light comes more often to our spiritual journey than most would want to admit. Renita Weems is a writer and biblical scholar and minister. And in her book, Listening for God, A Minister's Journey Through Silence and Doubt, she reflects on the winters of her faith experiences. She says, to admit that in the spiritual journey, highs are brief, sporadic, and rare, and that the human heart experiences far longer periods of dullness, emptiness, and silence, can be threatening. If people accept that inspiration and ecstasy are fleeting, hard to come by experiences, then what is there to look forward to if all we can expect is to stumble in the dark? Well, again, Dr. Canty might argue that stumbling in the dark might be exactly what we need. As she points out, darkness is this space where what is not yet known is birth. Darkness is a place of discomfort as well as a place of blessings. According to Canty, she reminds us that here lies creativity, the feminine, death, rebirth, mystery, and that it's within darkness that the transpersonal domain flourishes and mystical wisdom comes from these firsthand experiences with darkness, emptiness, the void. Canty helps us remember that darkness and light are not in opposition to one another, but rather they are in deep relationship. Like yin and yang, each hold the seed or spark to the other. I think we sense this in the people we know, like those of Frost's poem, those who have been acquainted with the night, whose own lives have been ones where they have known the darkness intimately, and it has shaped them, given wisdom and smooth edges in a way. And yet, our Western society suppresses these experiences, teaching us to fear both inner and outer darkness, which is ironic in some ways when you simply absorb the truth that is all around us. I'm being reminded and learning again that the universe is primarily composed of darkness. Dark matter makes up 85% of the universe as opposed to ordinary matter, such as that which is contained in stars, gas, and people. It's all around us, pervades everything, though we cannot see it. It's so much around us, so very little is known. And yet what happens in this dark matter is everything. Any of us who have ever attempted to garden know the truth of what can happen in darkness. It's in the dark quiet of the soil that the seed germinates, roots are grown, a potentiality begins, waiting to flourish in a way that could not happen without darkness. Renita Weems, reflecting on a time when the divine was silent to her, says this. She said, I've learned to trust the silence after years of fighting against it. I've learned to let go of my naive belief that breaking out into goosebumps at talk of the sacred was a signal of intimacy with the divine. I learned to trust the winter months of faith when it's difficult to remember why one ever bothered to believe. She continues, one of the most painful lessons is learning how to appreciate the hush of winter, when more growth takes place underground than above, and there in quiet, unnoticeable ways, it's possible to live through winter. And when we do, we're glad, for there are lessons learned in the winter that not only cannot be learned in the spring, but must be mastered in order to appreciate the spring. This word, chthonic, comes from Greek. It's a Greek word meaning in the earth or something concerning belonging to or inhabiting the underworld. In spiritual or transpersonal terms, it's been used in reference to the dark night of the soul, a period of doubt and uncertainty. This is a descent into the unknown, the unraveling of the self that has no reassurance of a creative rebirth. Often associated with St. John of the Cross, the dark night of the soul cuts across cultures. Again, Kathy explains that it's a metaphoric death of oneself, where the individual steps away from the familiar identity, descends into dark mystery, a time of liminality between worlds, and eventually emerges into a new identity that carries a larger gift for the world. She asserts that in order to gain wisdom and align with our truest callings for the world, we must dip into this darkness, facing our fears, allowing a death of ourselves. When we encounter the wisdom of darkness, the void, a death, the winter of our soul, we step into our maturity, our adulthood. Our current society's fixation on lightness, endless summer, and eternal youth bars this descent into darkness, leaving us in perpetual immaturity. There's a part in Renita Weems' book where she tells a story of kind of leaning into this maturity. It's a story of sitting and praying with her daughter at night. I thought I would just read it to you directly because it's so good. Renita Weems says this. She said, one day, after I'd finished reading for my daughter what felt like the 129th time in 130 days, her favorite bedtime story, I reminded my daughter that it was time for her to say her prayers and go to sleep. She lay quiet with her thumb in her mouth and stared intently into my face, interpreting her stillness as yet another tactic devised by the ingenious mind of a toddler to outwit her mother and to get mommy to postpone turning off the lights for 15 minutes more. I stiffened to show my authority. Come on, Savannah, let's say our prayers and go to sleep, I said, closing the book and resting it on her nightstand. I prayed already, mommy. She snatched the book back and pretended to read. She avoided my eyes and stared intently down at the pages, pretending to read it. The book was upside down in her hands. With mock indignation, I removed the book gently from her clutch, and holding her sheets up, I motioned for her to slide down underneath. When did you pray, Savannah? I asked. I prayed to the quiet, mommy, she said, sliding down in the streets. Oh, I replied skeptically. She turned her back, and before putting her thumb in her mouth, she said, when you were turning the pages, mommy, I was praying to the quiet. Weems continues, she said, I didn't demand that my daughter pray twice that evening. Learning to pray to the quiet while pages are turning and life is transitioning and the story muddles along would be talent enough to get her through decades of darkness. Because just because I didn't hear her pray didn't mean that God didn't hear her pray. Weems ends this section of her book with this wisdom. She says, there is in silence music to be heard, I'm told. For every note chosen, there are others not played, another sound, another melody, another message that waits to be heard. Trust the quiet to bear your prayers, I tell myself. I've spent a lifetime addicted to noise, and now that I'm smack in the midst of a long, still quiet, where I'm no longer sure how to recognize God's voice, I'm terrified. But pray to the quiet, my daughter teaches me. As winter solstice approaches this year, as we live in this place called the KUUF, which is often muted with the hush of snow, when it will be dark from about 4 p.m. until 8 p.m., I invite you to light a candle or maybe sit in the dark, to contemplate what have the winters of your spirit taught you, what has or is germinating in the dark. And when you're tempted to rush to turn on a light, maybe sit a few minutes more. Ask the darkness what it has to teach you. Let it sit with you as a mantle, knowing that no winter or night lasts forever. We end with a blessing that comes from Jan Richardson. It goes like this. All throughout these months, as the shadows have lengthened, this blessing has been gathering itself, making ready, preparing for this night. It has practiced walking in the dark, traveling with its eyes closed, feeling its way by memory, by touch, by the pull of the moon, even as it wanes. So believe me when I tell you this blessing will reach you, even if you have not light enough to read it. It will find you, even though you cannot see it coming. You will know the moment of its arriving by your release of the breath you have held so long, a loosening of the clenching in your hands, of the clutch around your heart, a thinning of the darkness that has drawn itself around you. This blessing does not mean to take the night away, but it knows its hidden roads, knows the resting spots along the path, knows what it means to travel in the company of a friend. So when this blessing comes, take its hand, get up, set out on the road you cannot see. This is the night when you can trust that any direction you go, you will be walking towards the dawn. Blessings to you all this winter solstice.